What's happening, everybody? This is Ryan Michael Ballo here to bring you another video on PSSD. So what you're looking at here is an MRI of the brain, and I'm going to show you and point out kind of the anatomy of the particular issue behind this person's PSSD or sexual function that mimics PSSD. And I want to do this to make a large number of points that I will expand upon later in this video. To give you the facts, in this particular case, straight to the point, this client's PSSD was caused by a pituitary adenoma, a benign, non-cancerous tumor in the pituitary gland that was functional, meaning it was secreting a hormone in excessive quantities, and that hormone was prolactin. What this illustrates is that PSSD itself and all of the characteristics of PSSD can be caused by many things. And in my history in consulting and treating people with PSSD, I have seen the root causes be many, many things, meaning the root causes are different for different people. There are certainly similarities, like dopamine signaling and dopamine receptor function deficiencies. That's prominent in almost everybody. And there's also androgen and estradiol work that needs to be targeted and worked on and dialed in as well. But between people, the causes are different biochemically and physiologically. So that's one major important point that I want to get across that I'll expand upon a little later. Another point I'll quick say before we get into this MRI is I have yet to see in 4 years of working with clients with PSSD that the 5-HT1A receptor is the root cause of their PSSD. I have yet to see that to be true. From my perspective, that theory is incorrect. Okay, so let's get into this MRI, and I'm going to show you a couple things with this person's images. So as you see, this is the person's eyeballs, just to give you some orientation. As we get further into these slices, the pituitary gland is going to present itself, and this is it here. So what you're looking at here is the pituitary gland. I'm circling it now. This thin line is the pituitary stalk, which communicates with the hypothalamus, or I should say the hypothalamus communicates with the pituitary through this stalk. Up here is the optic chiasm, which controls in some sense your vision. There's optic nerves that go to your eyes. And I'm not sure if you've ever seen a pituitary MRI, but this is an abnormal looking MRI, an abnormal looking pituitary gland. The pituitary, which is this sort of round structure, should be substantially smaller than this. In fact, somewhere around half the size. This pituitary gland has a 4 millimeter tumor in it. Okay, so this is a pituitary adenoma that is functional and secreting high levels of prolactin. So let's talk about the client. Client came to me with all of the classic symptoms of PSSD, and it was an unusual case, as I mentioned, because this person had never been on an SSRI ever in their life. And there were no other medications that were questionable, because there are some other medications that can cause syndromes related to PSSD or that mimic PSSD, the same type of sexual dysfunction, in fact. So I want to reinforce that point, that this person was not taking an SSRI. They came to me with erectile dysfunction, a complete absence of libido, a complete absence of genital sensation, a near inability to achieve or reach a climax, and when they were able to superficially induce it via pornography, the climax was not satisfying, and they were lacking sensation in the climax element of the sexual cascade. Okay, this is all of the classical symptoms of PSSD. I also want to say that this person was presenting with a strong degree of anhedonia as well. So when you've got lack of sensation, lack of libido, erectile dysfunction, lack of climax ability, lack of climax sensation, and hedonia, you pretty much have PSSD, right? This is exactly what the PSSD folks are presenting with. So to me, it was peculiar in looking at them initially, because none of the stuff that is in traditional PSSD folks' history was in this person's history. So the first thing that, aside from fact finding, that we do in trying to get to the root, or the roots, I should say, of people's PSSD is have them run a very specific set of labs. And in that set of labs, which includes testosterone, estradiol, prolactin, a few other things like vitamin D. I mean, these things sort of contribute to sexual function. You want to look at the entirety of the system for sexual function when dealing with PSSD, for the record, and do not be myopically focused on one thing. That is never going to get you leading toward any place where you can get better. And there are a few things that stood out. Number one, the prolactin levels in the blood for this person were in the 350 range, nanograms per milliliter. If you understand the range of prolactin, it should be between, call it 5 and 20 nanograms per milliliter. And 20, pushing 20 is kind of on the high side for prolactin. This person's reading was 357. That is extremely high. And looking at that, there potentially could be other causes, but there's really only one main cause, and that is a pituitary adenoma. So upon looking at the rest of the person's labs, which were pretty okay, this was a person that was on testosterone replacement therapy. Okay, so their total testosterone was in the 1,000 area, free testosterone just at the top of the reference range, estradiol pretty much in control at, I think it was 25, 26 picograms per milliliter. But the prolactin was a very, very obvious problem. Fast forward to how this person got better, we treated the pituitary adenoma. Okay, everything else was in check and where it needed to be, and we treated the pituitary adenoma. Now, in order to treat this, so there's a couple things that I want to just explain to you folks in looking at this and understanding that in this case a prolactinoma was causing this person's PSSD. Number one, in order to reduce the size of a prolactin secreting pituitary tumor, you have got to agonize the dopamine D2 receptors that sit on site on the pituitary, on the actual adenoma. Agonizing them actually kills, in this particular case, the lactotropes. These are particular types of cells in the tumor that are secreting prolactin. It induces apoptosis of the lactotropes, thereby shrinking the tumor and getting it into a normal size, and then hopefully getting prolactin into a normal range. Well, there were two drugs that we had to experiment with in order to do this. These are really the gold standard for dealing with pituitary adenomas in this dopamine D2 receptor agonizing capacity, and they were cabergoline and bromocriptine. The difference between these drugs, both of them are dopamine D2 agonists that are, I don't want to say exclusively centered, but pretty centered to the pituitary gland. The difference between these drugs is really the elimination half-life. Cabergoline has an extremely long half-life. I mean, it's estimated to be a week. It could be 2 weeks that the drug is in your system. It is active in your blood for a pretty long time. And, for some people, you might think that's useful. You're targeting, the issue right away. And great, I want to have something as potent as possible. For a lot of people, though, D2 agonism at this level produces side effects like nausea and dizziness, tinnitus for some people, mania, hypersexuality, etc. And we weren't really concerned about the hypersexuality in this particular case because ultimately in that direction is where we kind of wanted to go. Then there's bromocriptine, which is much more short-lived. Its half-life, meaning 50% of the drug is eliminated from the body at or around this period, is 6 hours. 6 hours instead of a week or 2 weeks like cabergoline is. So we trialed both and we ended up on cabergoline, we trialed both and ended up on bromocriptine because it was a better tolerated drug for this particular person. Okay, so let's talk about how things went. Upon starting bromocriptine, after about a week, this is 7 days, right? Client regained morning erections. This is something client hadn't had in many years. And despite being on testosterone replacement therapy and total testosterone being in the 1,000, it was like 1050 or something, which is, above the reference range and at the top of the reference range, depending on which range or who you ask, this person still had extreme sexual dysfunction and no morning erections. So within a week, morning erections came back. In the weeks 1 to weeks 4 time frame, client reported that libido, that mental visceral connection of arousal from, whatever you're interested in, same sex, opposite sex, whatever, started to come back, which was very, very promising to us in that we were in the right direction of getting them better, which, looking at everything else, it was very clear that this is what needed to be targeted. Prolactin, so you guys understand, and I'm sure a lot of you have done your research on this, is extremely inhibitory of sexual function in every capacity. Prolactin levels of 350 plus, well, then you're looking at a complete sexual blackout despite your testosterone numbers. Weeks 4 plus, everything basically continued to improve. The client had not only sustainable morning erections, but spontaneous erections throughout the day, which is something that, it's a good gauge for healthy sexual function as a man when you are getting spontaneous erections throughout the day. Libido continued to climb week by week. And then somewhere around, fast forward, because this definitely took some time, somewhere around month 2, 2.5, month 3, kind of the latter part of month 3, client experienced a lot of really positive things. Number 1, the morning erections were consistent, spontaneous erections were consistent, libido was extremely high, but sensation had returned. Full sensation had returned. They were experiencing, pre-ejaculate, pre-cum in just situations in which they were sexually aroused. And, to step out of like this formal, demonstration and conversation. The guy was like, yeah, I'm walking around like with boners all the time, and like I fucking feel awesome, and I like I'm feeling like back to myself, and this is amazing. Like I feel cured. Now, stepping back a bit, dealing with pituitary adenomas, it's something that for some people, you execute the D2 agonist treatment and pituitary tumor shrinks, prolactin goes down to normal levels, and they never have to be on medication again thereafter, right? It's just they're cured. And for some people, they have to intermittently be on dopamine agonist medication. And in some cases, from what I've seen, once you get prolactin down to a reasonable level, you can just work on dopamine without actually taking a hardcore dopamine agonist because they have side effects and potential long-term implications, and still keep the prolactin at bay in this particular case. What ended up happening with this person is that latter category, where, if they didn't continue monitoring at least, and that's, a blood test every month or so on prolactin, looking at prolactin, then the prolactin would eventually rise a lot slower than initially, right? And it wouldn't go past like 50 nanograms per milliliter. They'd have to do some dopamine work. The prolactin would go back down, and they'd regain all their sexual function back. It's just a matter of managing prolactin at this point for this particular person. Now, what does this, and just in case you guys are curious about some other images here of the pituitary adenoma, here's a really good look at it right there. This is the pituitary gland right here. It is much larger than it should be. This is the pituitary stalk. That's the optic chiasm. This pituitary gland should be half of this. It's exceptionally big. I believe this white stuff down here is just contrast from the MRI, so that's not anything to look at. Here's another look at it for those of you that understand pituitary MRIs. You've got the carotid arteries over here. Again, the optic chiasm, pituitary stalk. And there's a couple things that I want. So let's circle back, or I guess just dial out of the MRI here, and I guess we'll keep this on the screen. Let's get into discussion about this. So there's a couple things, and I'm sure there's a lot of questions that those of you that have PSSD have in this particular case, and I'd like to clear some of this up. Number one, don't assume that because you have PSSD that you have a prolactinoma. You would identify or confirm that the need to at least get an MRI if your prolactin levels are above the reference range. So keep that in mind. Do certainly check your prolactin levels, and do not think that you don't have to check your prolactin levels. If you have PSSD, you certainly need to. In fact, there's speculation for some people in the medical literature that, you know, the cause of some people's PSSD is in fact high levels of serum prolactin. Now, again, it gets deeper than that, and that's what I should segue to. Prolactin and dopamine, which I know a lot of you are very familiar with, that plays a major role, or at least people suspect that it plays a major role via the documented literature that dopamine agonists help people that have PSSD, at least for some of their symptoms. Dopamine and prolactin have a very, very interconnected relationship. And this is basically how the relationship works. Dopamine itself is prolactin inhibiting. Okay, prolactin inhibiting. It is in the medical literature actually referenced as the prolactin inhibiting hormone. Dopamine is referenced as the prolactin inhibiting hormone. Dopamine filters through the hypothalamus, through the pituitary stalk, down to the pituitary gland, and inhibits large amounts of prolactin release. This is in a normal person's brain. That's how it's supposed to function. Okay. I've seen cases, by the way, also where there were masses in the hypothalamus that were blocking the dopamine throughput through the infundibulum, the stalk, the pituitary stalk, down to the pituitary. And that was one of the reasons the person had sexual dysfunction. Okay. Now, high levels of prolactin also inhibit dopamine. Okay, they inhibit dopaminergic function, particularly in the pituitary gland, but also in other regions of the brain, but only at exceptionally high levels. Okay, so if your prolactin number is 15 to 19 or 20 nanograms per milliliter, that's probably not executing large-scale inhibition of dopaminergic neuron firing. But if it is in the 50 to 100 plus range, then through a negative feedback loop, it is inhibiting dopaminergic neuron firing and signaling in your brain. Okay, so that is something to keep in mind about this relationship between prolactin and dopamine. As we all know, dopamine plays a pretty central role in the biochemical profile of people with PSSD, and usually it's a combination of a deficiency in dopaminergic neuron firing, dopaminergic cell body creation and projection in various regions, not just the ventral tegmental area, and dopaminergic receptor dysfunction. So in this person's specific case, all of the various markers that need to be addressed in order to resolve PSSD, all of them but two were in check and where they need to be on the labs. Testosterone was in check, estradiol was in check. You can't really measure whether or not serotonin, tissue concentrations are in check, nor can you actually measure or identify if things like the serotonin 1A receptor, which again, it is taking people down a rabbit hole that is unnecessary, and I've never seen that be the case. There are, just to clear that up as a quick aside, there are downstream dopaminergic signaling pathways that are in one pathway or in one avenue controlled by the 5-HT1A receptor, as far as I can tell. But many things control dopaminergic signaling in the brain. Okay, the 5-HT1A receptor is just one of them that can influence it. I think that potentially could be the reason, as well as the research behind, the 5-HT1A autoreceptor and potential desensitization of the postsynaptic receptor, that people have gone down this what I believe is an inaccurate rabbit hole of looking at serotonin 1A receptor. But every other marker for this person was in check except for these two things. And once we got the prolactinoma under control and shrinking, and the prolactin levels within the reference range, because the person already had high levels of testosterone and managed estradiol, which I'm going to get to in a second, the PSSD resolved. Let's talk about that for a second. From my perspective, as I said, I've never seen, serotonin 1A, serotonin tissue concentrations, like serotonin 2C, 5-HT4, any of those receptors be singularly responsible for PSSD symptoms. I just, in the very beginning, when I started working on PSSD with clients, that was the prevailing theory. And, I very quickly ruled that out, because, it should be the case that if you antagonize the receptors, then you should be able to resensitize them and stop the potential, auto inhibition from happening on the presynaptic side. You could do that with a serotonin 1A antagonist, and there are plenty of them that are out there. So I'd come to realize very early on that theory was incorrect. That's the benefit of actually working with people and having a large history in neuroscience and physiology and anatomy, and modulating people's performance, if you will, biochemically. But what I came to learn in working with people that have this condition is that you really have to approach it from every perspective in order to get a person better. Look, the sexual system can recover, right? It can become normalized and function like a normal man's sexual system can function, but you have to know which systems to target. This is why, and it's a multifaceted, complex approach, or at least it has to be a multifaceted, complex approach in order to resolve PSSD. Testosterone is involved, yes, because testosterone is involved in sexual function. Estradiol, or E2, on the labs, is also involved, because it should be. I mean, guys that are on TRT, some of them have high levels of testosterone, total and free, but their estradiol creeps past a certain point, and then they've got not only erectile dysfunction, but some of them lose sensation. The same is true, interestingly, with extremely low levels of estradiol. So total test, free test, totally within range. Estradiol sitting at like between 10 and 15, or God forbid in the single digits, picograms per milliliter, and then they've got sexual dysfunction that mimics PSSD. So keep that in mind as well. All of these things play a role. So when you're looking at your PSSD, I'll just give you guys like some tips. You need to be approaching it from every single angle, from the perspective of you should be optimizing everything, but kind of also from the perspective of a process of elimination, right? And you got to be really careful with that, because if you look at your testosterone numbers and they're in range, but you still have PSSD, you may think you have to move on to something else, like estradiol or prolactin or dopamine, but in range may not be optimal for your sexual function. I mean, I've seen guys that have 600, 700 nanograms per deciliter total test, mid-level of the range, of the reference range, free test, and their sexual function is still inhibited. But once they got into the 900, 1000 nanograms per deciliter total test, very high end of the reference range free test, and then managing estradiol to keep it in range for them, which, by the way, is a moving target, or it's different for different people, then they regain sexual function. But circling back, you've got to focus on everything, not only the sex hormones, but predominantly dopamine. Now, if dopamine inhibition or signaling deficiency is not being caused by a pituitary tumor or, exceptionally high levels of prolactin, then that opens up another can of worms for treating PSSD. And this is why I say the causes are different for different people. And predominantly you would want to be looking at tyrosine hydroxylase, a dopamine conversion enzyme, potentially dopa decarboxylase, the sort of finishing dopamine conversion enzyme, which takes L-dopa and converts it to usable dopamine, but usually the former. And then dopaminergic neuron regeneration. Those are the things, dopaminergic neuron function in general, leading toward regeneration if you want to make it better. And those are the things that get the dopamine system firing normally again. From my perspective and working with people, again, I don't want to give you advice and have you go execute it if you have PSSD and think this is going to solve your PSSD, but a research chemical called 9-methyl-beta-carboline has been very useful in recovering the dopaminergic systems of some of my clients, not all of them, of some of them. There are many other dopamine-centered compounds out there, but 9-MeBC seems to be the most effective, and that it's an anti-Parkinson's drug. That's what it was initially studied for and built for. There's not much research behind it, but there are a few research papers that demonstrate its ability to upregulate the genetic basis or the transcription factors for tyrosine hydroxylase as well as dopaminergic neuron function. And what it ends up doing is regenerating dopamine neurons, upregulating tyrosine hydroxylase, upregulating some dopamine receptor function, and therefore partially or fully restoring dopaminergic, function in a person's brain. Again, this is not for everybody, and that isn't going to necessarily cure you of PSSD. That's assuming you don't have high levels of prolactin or something else that's inhibiting dopamine at large scale, and that your testosterone numbers and your estradiol numbers are, in check, and particularly testosterone on the high end of the reference range. So let's step back a second and kind of just, discuss. Let me just give you an overview of what we just talked about. The main points that I want to get across to folks is that, as you see in this client case, PSSD is not always caused by SSRIs, right? It can be caused by many, many things. I mean, I've seen people's PSSD resolve once we got their testosterone in the right range and we managed their estradiol. Just those two things, right? They thought, everything was fine because their testosterone was sitting at 600 and estradiol was at 25 or something, and free test was in the middle of the reference range. Doc goes, "You're fine." I mean, that's how doctors are. They're, some of them are just not in tune or educated, frankly, on PSSD. I've seen PSSD-like symptoms caused by too high estradiol, right? Simply E2 on the labs. Everything else was fine, and once we got the E2 in a reasonable range for that person, then their sensation came back, their morning erections came back, their erectile function kind of in general came back, and their libido came back. Some of you would do yourselves a good bit of justice going and perusing the testosterone subreddit. It's reddit.com/r/testosterone, and reading people's stories of what happens to them, men's stories, what happens to them when their estradiol either gets too low or too high, and how the symptoms that they are presenting mimic PSSD, at least in some sense. But what, overarchingly, the point that I want to make to you folks is that this condition can be caused by many things. And that's what I've seen for sure in my history of working with people with PSSD. And the one thing I want to caution you against and discourage people from doing, because I peruse the forums and, I read some of your guys' posts about PSSD, and, I know there was a client of mine who, maybe one day I'll post the actual interactions between him and I that jumped off the bandwagon and, became sort of belligerent with me and then went and lied about me on the web. It was like none of the stuff that he said about me was true. And I'm, in some sense, kind of being slandered or, called a scammer or something. Like, none of that is true. I mean, for the record, I just want to kind of sneak this in here. Those of you that actually know me know that I care very much about resolving this condition, and I care very much about my clients, but I also care very much about compliance when, doing PSSD consults and people following my instructions. At the end of the day, I mean, if you end up wanting to work with me, which this is not what this is about, I've got to have you following instructions and not thinking that, the prevailing theory on PSSDforum.org is the theory that, why isn't Ryan looking at this, or that's the theory to look at it. And what I'm really trying to get at by sneaking that in is there are a lot of theories in the forums that are incorrect, right? And I'm not trying to be like a jerk. I mean, you guys are all researching, and that is good. That's what you need to be doing. But people are very dogmatic about their positions on what causes PSSD or what's at the root of PSSD based on like a window they induced from one compound or the other and the biochemical underpinnings of, what that chemical does. And that influences people to not think outside of that box. And that's what I want to discourage people from doing, and I want to caution people against. PSSD does not have a defined root cause. Not because we don't know it, because we do, right? Or my work has showed me that there are various things that can cause a person to have PSSD. And PSSD can also be present in its exact form, as I explained with this client, without the presence of a selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor. Okay, so I just gave you guys a bunch of points, but the main one was, there's a lot of theories out there in the forums, and what you need to do is figure out what applies to you. There is no root cause. It's not the 5-HT1A receptor. It's not strictly a lack of dopamine firing. It's not strictly deficiency in dopamine receptor function. It's not strictly low levels of testosterone. It's not strictly high levels of estradiol. It's not strictly high levels of prolactin. It's not exclusively high levels of serotonin. In fact, that whole theory, you would do yourself a pretty large justice or favor in throwing out the serotonin theory completely. And I probably get some flack for that, and I hope I do, honestly. I mean, that's great. You guys can comment or whatever, but in 4 years of working on PSSD, going on 5 now actually, I have never seen serotonin be at the root of PSSD. What I think is happening on the SSRI side is the SSRI, when you start fussing with serotonin at that level, keeping it very actively around in the synaptic space, it influences a lot of systems, not the least of which is dopamine, but also neurosteroids and sex hormones, right? These are the bases, if you will, for PSSD, in addition to dopamine as a neurotransmitter. Okay, so let me summarize. In this particular case, it was a pituitary tumor that caused this person's PSSD. Testosterone was on the high end of the reference range, free testosterone high normal, estradiol within range. Dopamine was probably a problem, and that was resolved via shrinking the tumor via a dopamine D2 agonist, which again, in this particular case, binds to the lactotropes, receptor sites on the lactotropes on the pituitary adenoma. In total, it took 3-4 months for full sexual function to return, but a good bit of their sexual function, in increments had returned prior to that. This person did not take a SSRI ever, but presented with exactly the same symptoms, including anhedonia, which, by the way, resolved as well after all of this was completed. And this is a classic example of why you should not be very myopic about what you think is causing your PSSD, because it can be a lot of things, as I described. Okay, so I hope this gives people some food for thought, maybe some rethinking of of what exactly is at the root of your PSSD. The intention of this video was to be as informative as I can, to show you some different perspectives on how to think about how to resolve PSSD, specifically in approaching it from every angle and not focusing on a one neurotransmitter receptor site or neurotransmitter signaling system exclusively. Right? You got to think outside of that and look at every system and diligently hunt through a lot of blood work the root cause or causes of your PSSD. Okay, hope that makes sense. Thank you so much for watching. For those of you that want to inquire about working with me, I'm largely booked on PSSD work. I don't do many of them per month for a lot of reasons. I have a very low compliance rate, unfortunately, which hurts me or something if I wanted to actually go and promote the service much, which I don't, because I've got a business outside of working with PSSD, and it's just something that is more of a I don't want to call it a passion project, but more of something like I feel like I've been recruited to do, and it's like I owe people to do it. I understand how all of this works, and for me to be sitting back and not helping people kind of makes me feel like I'm not doing anything with my life or something. But yeah, there are open slots to work with me on an ongoing capacity, depending on the month. I will have you know though that there are prerequisites for working with me on PSSD, and a couple of them are, look, if you're even thinking about working with me, first of all, I need you to be financially comfortable, because we're going to be doing a lot of work, and the type of work that from my side that I'm going to be doing is very time intensive. But also you need to be willing to comply with what I am having you do. Look, I've got guys that are better from PSSD, and a lot of you have ragged on me about why can't I share it? If you're a high profile business person, do you want your name in a PSSD forum? You don't. You want to forget that it ever happened. When you're better, you never want to go to a forum again, and you don't want your name out there. So to date, no one has been okay with me posting their names on the web about their junk problems. It's just not how it works. And for the record, the guy that went and offered me it was $20,000 or something in escrow, that's not how this works. I don't take escrow money and then solve your PSSD when we have a service for it that is much less than what you were offering me. And also, that person, for the records, I know this is out there too, came with a very sort of derogatory tone, and I want nothing to do with that. I understand that a lot of you that have this condition are very frustrated with it. Believe me, I get it, right? Because I've worked with some of you. I've worked with people that have it, and I get how frustrating it is. But I no toxicity, guys. I will not work with people that are that are being toxic and offering me $20,000 in escrow. That's just not how these consults work. And if you're going to approach me in some derogatory way, of course I'm not, of course I'm not going to work with you and do that. That's just not how this works. So, if you're considering, working with me at PSSD, just have your ducks in a row and make sure that you're going to be willing to comply. Be ready to work for 6 to 12 months to get this resolved. Be ready to get as many labs as are necessary for us to determine what's wrong, what needs to be modified, and be ready for this to take a lot of time. Be ready to have a lot of patience. Be ready not to expect, resolution, or at least, windows of recovery right away. It's a long, fact-finding, in some cases painstaking process, but there is a process. And rest assured, if you follow the process, you will get to the root of your PSSD. It's just a matter of getting it done and running through the motion. So thank you so much for watching. LiveCortex.com is where you can find consulting on PSSD if you're interested. Again, I don't have many slots open ever, but they're depending on when you inquire, there may be slots open for you to work. Just make sure that you're, again, ready to follow my instructions. You're financially comfortable to actually do it, because it's a monthly fee to have me help you on resolving PSSD. For those of you that are just here to get information, which is primarily why I did this video, thank you for being with me. It's been a pleasure talking with you. I hope I've given you a lot of things to think about. I hope I've opened up, or hopefully, modified your paradigm of how you're thinking about resolving your PSSD. And lastly, I want to say you can get better. I have seen it. You can get better from this, what is a horrible condition that is life debilitating in many ways. And, you guys aren't heard enough and sort of casted away in this little sector of the internet and not recognized by the medical community. It's not fun to be medically gaslit. I've had it happen to me before. Just know that, from my perspective, you are not, I would never gaslight you. And I know you guys are experiencing a real phenomenon of a condition that is pretty terrible, and that's the that's the fallacy of SRIs. That's a whole other conversation. It's been a pleasure being with you. Thank you so much for listening. I guess we'll talk to you next time.